The dog barked just as the spoon reached the billionaire's lips. Not a playful bark, but a warning. The bowl was knocked from the table, shattering across the marble floor. The old man shouted in anger, then suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. As servants rushed in, the dog stood between them and the fallen billionaire, growling at one person only, the maid. By nightfall, poison would be discovered, and the world would soon learn why a billionaire left everything he owned to a dog. Maxwell Cain had built an empire worth $8 billion. Steel, real estate, technology. His name was carved into skylines across 3 continents. His signature appeared on contracts that shaped economies. His decisions created jobs for hundreds of thousands of people. His investments turned small companies into industry giants. But at 74 years old, with silver hair thinning and hands trembling from age, Maxwell sat alone in a mansion with 47 rooms. The house stretched across 12 acres of manicured grounds in Connecticut, surrounded by walls that kept the world at bay. Inside those walls lived a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. His children had stopped calling years ago. His wife had died a decade prior. Her last words to him a whisper he replayed every night in the darkness. She had said his name, squeezed his hand, and told him she hoped he would learn what love actually meant before it was too late. He hadn't understood then. He was beginning to understand now. The business partners only reached out when they needed his signature on documents that would make them richer. The board members sent fruit baskets on holidays with cards signed by assistants who had never met him. The charitable organizations that bore his name knew his checkbook better than they knew his face. And in that vast, echoing house filled with priceless art and imported marble, there was only one heartbeat that greeted him every morning with genuine joy. Argus, a German shepherd with amber eyes and a coat like burnt copper. Maxwell had found him 6 years ago, shivering behind a dumpster in the rain on a cold November night. He had been driving home from a board meeting where they had voted to cut pensions for 3,000 workers to maximize shareholder returns. Maxwell had voted with them. He always voted with them. That was business. But driving through the industrial district afterward, something had made him slow down near an abandoned warehouse. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fate. He had seen movement in his headlights. A shape huddled against the dumpster, barely visible in the rain. Someone had abandoned the dog there. Left him to die? Maxwell had stopped his car in the middle of the empty street, not caring about traffic or schedules or the dinner waiting for him at home. He had crouched down despite his aching knees, despite his expensive suit getting soaked, despite every logical reason to just call animal control and let them handle it. He had offered his hand to this shivering, broken creature, and Argus had limped forward and licked his palm. That simple gesture of trust from an animal who had every reason to fear humans had cracked something open inside Maxwell's chest. They had been inseparable ever since. While the world saw Maxwell Cain as a ruthless titan of industry, Argus saw something else entirely. A man who woke at 5 in the morning to feed him before feeding himself. A man who spoke to him in soft tones when the thunder rolled and the lightning lit up the windows. A man who sat on the floor beside him during the long, lonely nights when sleep wouldn't come and memories crowded too close. A man who had built walls around his heart to survive in a world of sharks and predators, but who let those walls crumble when it was just the two of them. Maxwell trusted no one anymore, except Argus. The bond between them had grown deeper with each passing year, becoming something Maxwell couldn't quite explain to the few people who asked. On the days when Maxwell's arthritis flared and he could barely stand, when his fingers couldn't grip a pen without pain shooting up his arm, Argus would press against his leg, offering steady support. The dog seemed to sense the pain before Maxwell even acknowledged it. When Maxwell received news that another business deal had fallen through, or that another old friend had passed away, or that his children had been quoted in a magazine article talking about their success without mentioning his name once, he would bury his face in Argus's fur and let himself feel the weight of it all. The dog never judged, never offered empty platitudes, never told him to be stronger or get over it or move on. Just stayed, just breathed, just existed beside him in the darkness until morning came and the mask had to go back on. Maxwell had begun talking to Argus like he would a trusted confidant, saying things out loud that he had never admitted to another living soul, telling him about the mistakes he had made in raising his children, about how he had prioritized board meetings over birthday parties, conference calls over bedtime stories, business trips over family vacations. He had thought he was building a legacy for them, securing their future, teaching them the value of hard work and dedication. But somewhere along the way, they had learned to measure love in dollar signs. And when he could no longer write the checks they wanted, when he started questioning their spending or suggesting they earn their own way, they had simply stopped pretending to care. I failed them, boy, Maxwell would say, scratching behind Argus's ears in the way that made the dog's eyes close with contentment. Or maybe I succeeded too well. I taught them that money solves everything, that success means power, that emotions are weaknesses to be hidden behind boardroom doors and quarterly reports. He would pause, looking into those amber eyes that seemed to understand everything he couldn't say. You're smarter than all of them. You know what matters. You know that sitting here with me on a Tuesday night means more than all the steel and concrete and stock certificates in the world. Argus would rest his chin on Maxwell's knee, and for a few moments, the old man would feel less alone, less like he was disappearing into the vast, empty spaces of his own life. But there was someone else in the house who had learned to smile at the right moments, who had studied Maxwell like a book written in a language only she bothered to learn. Her name was Catherine Moreau, 38 years old with an elegance that seemed effortless but was actually carefully constructed. French accent that made everything she said sound cultured and refined, though she had actually grown up in New Jersey and cultivated the accent deliberately after spending 6 months in Paris. Perfectly styled dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that never had a strand out of place. Always dressed in crisp black uniforms that spoke of professionalism and discretion, pressed and perfect even at the end of long days. She had been hired as a maid 3 years ago, highly recommended by an agency that catered to the ultra-wealthy, the kind of agency that did extensive background checks and vetting and promised only the most trustworthy employees. Maxwell had barely noticed her at first. She cleaned quietly, moving through rooms like a ghost who left everything perfect in her wake. Served meals with precision, always anticipating his preferences before he stated them. Spoke only when spoken to, maintaining the appropriate distance between employer and employee. But over time, Catherine had made herself indispensable through 1,000 small gestures that seemed spontaneous, but were actually calculated with the precision of a chess grandmaster planning moves 10 steps ahead. She learned how Maxwell liked his coffee, black, 1 sugar, served at exactly 7:15 in the morning in his favorite mug, the one his wife had given him on their 20th anniversary. She remembered which books he was reading and placed them on his nightstand with bookmarks at exactly the page where he had stopped. She noticed when he was having a bad pain day and would quietly adjust his schedule, canceling non-essential appointments without being asked. She listened when he talked about his late wife, nodding with what seemed like genuine sympathy, asking thoughtful questions that made him feel heard for the first time in years. "You're very kind, Catherine," Maxwell had said one evening after she had brought him a blanket without being asked, noticing he had been shivering slightly while reading in his study. She had smiled warmly, that practiced smile that reached her lips but not quite her eyes, though Maxwell never noticed the distinction. "You deserve kindness, Mr. Kane. Not everyone in your position receives it. Too many people see the money and the power and forget there's a human being underneath it all." The words had landed perfectly because they were true. That was Catherine's gift, wrapping lies in enough truth that they became indistinguishable. But behind that smile lived a mind calculating every dollar, every asset, every opportunity. Catherine Moreau had not come from wealth. She had clawed her way up from poverty in a small town outside of Lyon. Though that part of her story was actually true, one of the few pieces of her history she hadn't fabricated. She had worked degrading jobs, endured the cruelty of entitled employers who treated her like furniture, like a thing that existed only to serve them. She had served drinks to men who propositioned her while their wives sat across the table. Cleaned toilets in hotels where the staff was forbidden from making eye contact with guests, where they were expected to be invisible, to appear only when needed and disappear the moment their service was complete. She had been spat on, yelled at, dismissed, and discarded. She had watched wealthy people waste in a day what would have fed her family for a month. She had smiled through it all, while her soul calcified into something hard and cold and determined. And she had decided long ago that she would never be poor again, never be powerless again, never be invisible again. She would do whatever it took. Whatever it took. When she took the job at the Kane estate, she had done months of research beforehand. Maxwell Kane, widower, estranged from his children. Richard, the eldest, who ran a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley and visited twice a year at Christmas and his father's birthday. Victoria, the middle child, who organized charity galas and appeared in society magazines and called only when she needed donations for her causes. And James, the youngest, who was attempting a political career and used his father's name for credibility while keeping his actual distance. No close friends. His poker buddies had died off or moved to retirement communities in Florida. $8 billion in assets spread across real estate, stocks, bonds, and controlling interests in 3 major corporations. And most importantly, he was vulnerable, lonely, desperate for human connection, starving for someone to simply care whether he lived or died. Catherine began her work slowly, methodically, with the patience of someone who had spent years planning this moment. A touch on his arm when serving tea, lingering just long enough to register as comfort without crossing into impropriety. "Are you feeling well today, Mr. Kane? You look tired. Are you sleeping enough?" A concerned furrow of her brow when he coughed, making a mental note to mention it again the next day, to create the impression of consistent care. "That cough is still bothering you. Should I call Dr. Brennan? I worry about you." She positioned herself as the only person who truly cared about his well-being. The only one who noticed when he was in pain. The only one who asked how he was feeling and actually waited for an answer instead of treating it as a formality. And Maxwell, starved for genuine human connection, began to trust her. He found himself looking forward to their brief conversations, to the moments when she would sit with him while he had his morning coffee and they would discuss the news or the weather or nothing in particular. To the way she remembered small details about his day, asking about the conference call he had mentioned worrying about, or whether the medication his doctor prescribed was helping his arthritis. He began to think of her as more than staff, perhaps even as something close to family, filling the void his actual family had left behind. Catherine encouraged this transformation carefully, nurturing it like a gardener cultivating poison ivy, making sure it grew in exactly the direction she wanted. She began staying late, claiming she wanted to make sure he was settled for the evening, that he had everything he needed for the night. She would sit with him while he ate dinner in that enormous dining room designed for 20 guests but occupied by one, keeping him company, making him laugh with stories that were 50% truth and 50% fabrication. She asked about his business ventures, his past achievements, his regrets, playing the role of genuinely interested confidant. And she listened with rapt attention, making mental notes of everything that might be useful later. His relationships with his children, his opinions about his will, his thoughts on legacy, and what happened to wealth after death. "Your children don't appreciate what you've built," she said one evening, her voice carefully modulated between sympathy and righteous indignation, walking the line perfectly. "All of this, everything you've created, the empire you spent 50 years building, and they can't even be bothered to visit. When was the last time Richard actually came here? 6 months ago? 7? Maxwell had sighed deeply, the sound of a man carrying too much weight for too long. "They have their own lives. Their own families. I understand that. I wasn't around much when they were growing up, so I can't really blame them for not being around now. But that's different, Catherine insisted, leaning forward slightly, her eyes intense with manufactured passion. You were building something, creating opportunities, providing for them. What's their excuse? Richard runs his firm from a laptop. He could work from anywhere. Victoria's charity work is important, sure, but she could organize a gala from Connecticut just as easily as Manhattan. And James, well, politicians are supposed to care about family values, aren't they? Seems hypocritical to campaign on family while ignoring your own father. The words were poison dripped slowly into an open wound. Maxwell tried to defend his children, the way parents do even when they know their children have failed them. They're busy, successful. I'm proud of what they've accomplished. Of course you are, Catherine said softly, reaching across to pat his hand, the gesture seeming spontaneous but timed perfectly. You're a good father. Better than they deserve, honestly. Family makes time, Mr. Kane. Real family. People who love you make time. They don't send checks on birthdays and show up twice a year out of obligation. She paused, letting the words sink in like water into stone, patient and persistent. Some of us understand loyalty. Some of us know what it means to be there for someone, not because of what they can give us, but because it's right. Because they deserve it. It was masterful manipulation, a symphony of psychological warfare played so softly that the victim never heard the music. Subtle enough that Maxwell thought these were his own realizations, not seeds carefully planted in his mind. Patient enough that the harvest would come naturally, without force. Poisonous enough to kill relationships that had taken decades to build. But Argus never believed a word of it. From the moment Catherine entered the house 3 years ago, the dog watched her with an intensity that troubled the other staff members. When she walked past, his ears would flatten against his skull, the physical tell of an animal sensing threat. When she reached toward Maxwell, a low rumble would start deep in Argus's chest, a warning growl that came from somewhere primal, from instincts bred into dogs over thousands of years of protecting their packs from predators. When she entered a room, the dog would position himself between her and Maxwell, his body tense, every muscle coiled, his eyes tracking her every movement with the focus of a hunter tracking prey. Argus, stop that. Maxwell would scold gently, embarrassed by his companion's behavior. Catherine is our friend. She's helping me. You need to be nice to her. But the dog knew better. Animals sense things humans miss, perceive realities that human rational thought dismisses as impossible. The micro-expressions that flash across a face before the mask slips back into place. The momentary sneer, the flash of contempt, the calculated coldness that appears for a fraction of a second before the smile returns. The scent of adrenaline masked by perfume, the chemical signature of someone constantly calculating, constantly on edge, constantly performing. The subtle tension in a person's movements when they're pretending, when every gesture is considered rather than natural. The tiny physiological tells that betray true intention, the dilation of pupils when discussing money, the slight acceleration of heartbeat when lying, the microscopic changes in breathing patterns that indicate deception. Argus saw the way Catherine's smile never quite reached her eyes, how the muscles around her mouth would move but the muscles around her eyes would remain still, creating the uncanny valley effect that humans notice subconsciously but rarely acknowledge consciously. The way her pupils would contract slightly when Maxwell mentioned his wealth, the predatory focus that would sharpen her gaze for just a moment before she remembered to look sympathetic. The way her hands would clench and unclench when she thought no one was watching, releasing tension from the constant performance. He noticed how she watched Maxwell with cold calculation when she thought no one was looking, studying him the way a scientist studies a specimen, cataloging weaknesses and vulnerabilities. How her gaze would linger on the paintings hanging in the hallways, the sculptures positioned throughout the house, the antique furniture that had been in the family for generations, assessing value, planning acquisition, mentally inventorying everything she intended to own. He heard her on the phone late at night, speaking in rapid French about inheritance laws and mental competency evaluations, about how long elderly people typically lived after health decline, about lawyers who specialized in contested wills. His hearing picked up frequencies and details that human ears missed, catching conversations through closed doors, around corners, in moments when Catherine thought she was alone. Maxwell dismissed the dog's behavior as protectiveness, the natural territorialism of an animal bonded to its owner. He's just territorial, that's all. Dogs get attached to their owners, possessive even. He probably thinks you're taking me away from him, taking up time and attention that used to be his alone. Catherine dismissed it with a practiced laugh that sounded genuine to human ears, hitting all the right notes of amused tolerance. Dogs can be so territorial, can't they? So possessive. It's almost sweet, really, how devoted he is to you. Shows what a good master you are. But her eyes, when they flicked toward Argus, held something else entirely. Something cold. Something calculating. Something that promised retribution if the dog ever stopped being an obstacle and became an actual threat. She began carrying treats in her pocket, premium beef jerky that cost $15 a bag, gourmet dog cookies from a boutique bakery that catered to wealthy pet owners, even filet mignon scraps from Maxwell's dinner. She would extend her hand whenever the dog was near, smile that warm smile, and speak in gentle tones that dripped with false sweetness. Come here, boy. Come on. We should be friends, shouldn't we? I'm here to help your master. I only want what's best for him. We're on the same side, you and I. The dog never took them. He would stare at her extended hand, nostrils flaring as he scented whatever was being offered, processing information that his instincts translated into a simple message, danger. Then he would turn away deliberately, dismissively, sometimes looking back at Maxwell, as if to say, can't you see? Can't you smell the lie on her? Can't you sense what I sense? Catherine's smile would falter for just a moment when the dog rejected her offerings, a micro-expression of rage flashing across her features, there and gone in an instant. A flash of anger would ignite in her eyes, Her jaw would clench imperceptibly. Her fingers would tighten on the treat before she forced herself to relax. Then the mask would return, brighter than before, more determined. Well, I tried. Can't say I didn't try. He's just very loyal to you, Mr. Kane. That's a good quality in a dog. You're lucky to have him. But loyalty wasn't what she saw when she looked at Argus. She saw an obstacle, a problem to be solved, an inconvenient variable in an otherwise perfect equation. The dog was making her work harder than she had anticipated, creating complications in a plan that was supposed to be simple. She had dealt with suspicious children, wary attorneys, protective nurses who questioned her presence and her motives. But an animal that couldn't be bought, threatened, or fooled. That was new. That was dangerous. That was infuriating. Because if the dog kept making Maxwell doubt her, kept positioning himself as a barrier between them, kept performing this constant pantomime of warning and protection, her entire plan would fall apart. 3 years of careful manipulation, of patient cultivation, of strategic positioning. All of it could unravel because of an animal who saw through her masks. And Catherine Moreau had not come this far, had not endured this much, had not sacrificed this much of her humanity, to be thwarted by a dog. The plan had taken Catherine 2 years to develop, 2 years of research and preparation, and building the foundation that would support the ultimate deception. She had befriended Maxwell's estate attorney at a charity gala 18 months ago, a black tie affair where she had worn a dress that cost 3 months of her salary and played the role of cultured professional rather than domestic servant. Gerald Morrison was a professional, discreet, bound by attorney-client privilege and ethical guidelines that should have made him impenetrable. But after 3 glasses of Dom Perignon and Catherine's skillful questions disguised as innocent curiosity, wrapped in flattery and genuine interest in his important work, he had let slip the basics. Everything was set to be divided among Maxwell's 3 children. Richard receiving 40% as the eldest and the one expected to manage the business interests. Victoria and James each receiving 25%, with the remaining 15% distributed among various charities. The staff would receive generous severance packages, 6 months' salary for every year worked, ensuring loyalty and discretion. But Catherine would receive nothing beyond her standard salary and the standard 2-month severance. That had to change. That would change. Catherine Moreau had not spent 3 years of her life playing servant, bowing and scraping and saying, yes, Mr. Kane, and right away, Mr. Kane, to walk away with a few $1,000s when billions were at stake. She began mentioning, casually, how cruel it was that his children never visited, dropping these observations into conversation like stones into still water, watching the ripples spread. They only call when they want something, don't they, Mr. Kane? She would say this while arranging flowers in the vase on his desk, or pouring his evening brandy, or adjusting the blinds to block the afternoon sun, her tone carefully neutral. Just an observation. Just a fact. Just something she happened to notice. Maxwell would sigh, the sound of old wounds reopening, of scabs picked at until they bled again. They're busy with their own lives. Richard has his company to run. He's managing $3 billion in assets, making decisions that affect thousands of people. Victoria has her social obligations, her charity work. She raised $2 million for cancer research last year alone. James has his political career. He's preparing to run for state senate, which is incredibly demanding. Still, Catherine would say, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch lingering just long enough to register comfort without crossing into impropriety, calculated to the second. Family should make time. My mother used to say that people make time for what they value. Everything else is just excuses wrapped in prettier paper. She would pause meaningfully, letting the words settle. When my father was dying, my brothers and I took turns sitting with him. We all had jobs, obligations, responsibilities. But we made time because he mattered more than any of that. Because when someone you love is in their final years, you don't get that time back. She watered the seeds of resentment carefully, methodically, like a gardener tending poison ivy, making sure it grew in exactly the direction she wanted. Pointing out forgotten birthdays. Richard had missed the last 2, sending expensive gifts ordered by his assistant, but never calling. Missed holidays. Last Christmas, Victoria had sent a card but hadn't visited, claiming she had committed to spending the holiday with her husband's family in Aspen. The business deals his children had made using his name, without his permission or involvement. James had recently launched a political action committee called the Kane Foundation for Better Government, without consulting Maxwell, trading on the family name for legitimacy. The interviews where they discussed their success without mentioning the foundation he had laid. Richard had been profiled in Forbes last month, discussing his investment strategy and mentioning he had learned from observing successful businessmen, but never naming Maxwell specifically. Maxwell began to feel it, the cold truth of abandonment settling into his bones like winter frost. The slow realization that he had become less a father and more a bank account, a resource to be managed until it could be inherited. That his children calculated the costs and benefits of spending time with him the way they calculated return on investment. That every phone call had an agenda, every visit had a purpose, every conversation eventually circled back to money or favors or connections he could provide. And Catherine was always there to soften the blow, to offer comfort, to remind him that some people still valued him for who he was, not what he had. You're not alone, Mr. Kane, she would say, her hand on his, her voice warm with what seemed like genuine affection. Some of us truly appreciate you. See you as a person, not a portfolio. Care about whether you're happy or in pain or lonely. Care about whether you're actually living or just existing in this big, empty house. She would pause meaningfully, her eyes searching his face. Some of us understand what you've sacrificed to build all of this. The time, the relationships, the parts of yourself you had to cut away to succeed in a world that eats the weak. What you've given up to create something that will outlast you. It was insidious, brilliant, poisonous in the most literal sense, because Catherine wasn't just poisoning Maxwell's relationships. She was preparing to poison Maxwell himself. The ultimate betrayal wrapped in false concern and manufactured care. She had also begun researching poisons 6 months ago, spending hours on the dark web, using encrypted browsers and VPN connections that routed through servers in 6 different countries. She had learned about Tor networks and cryptocurrency and how to navigate the digital underground where anything could be purchased if you knew where to look. She needed something that could mimic a heart attack or natural decline, something that would blend seamlessly into the expected death of an elderly man with a history of cardiac issues. Something that wouldn't be detected in an initial examination by a family doctor who saw aging and assumed natural causes, who would sign a death certificate without ordering extensive toxicology. Something that would give her time to position herself, to manipulate the narrative, to ensure that when Maxwell died, she would be seen as the faithful caregiver who had been there at the end, who deserved to be remembered in his will. Oleandrin, extracted from oleander plants, fit perfectly. She had learned that oleander was one of the most poisonous plants in the world, that every part of it was toxic, that even burning it and inhaling the smoke could kill. Tasteless when properly prepared and diluted. Deadly in small doses that accumulated in the body over time. Often missed in standard toxicology unless specifically tested for, because most coroners didn't think to look for exotic plant alkaloids when examining elderly patients. Symptoms that mimicked heart disease, kidney failure, general decline in elderly patients, weakness, dizziness, nausea, confusion, arrhythmia. And most importantly for her purposes, it worked slowly. She could administer it over weeks, gradually weakening him, creating a narrative of declining health while positioning herself as the concerned caregiver trying desperately to help as he mysteriously faded. Catherine had sourced it through dark web channels she had discovered during her research, marketplaces hidden behind layers of encryption where vendors sold everything from stolen identities to military weapons to poisons that left no trace. She had used cryptocurrency purchased through Bitcoin ATMs scattered across 3 states, never using the same machine twice. She had routing everything through encrypted networks that bounced her digital footprint through servers in Romania, Singapore, Brazil, making it virtually impossible to trace. She had been meticulous in covering her tracks, paranoid about leaving any evidence. Used public Wi-Fi in different cities, driving 2 hours to Hartford, then 3 hours to Boston, then 4 hours to Philadelphia, never establishing a pattern. Created false identities with burner phones purchased with cash. Made sure nothing could be traced back to her, that every digital breadcrumb led nowhere. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of plan that only works because of its very simplicity. She would administer the poison slowly over several weeks, small doses that would gradually accumulate in his system without triggering immediate alarm, causing Maxwell's health to deteriorate gradually, naturally, in a way that looked like the inevitable decline of age. In his weakened state, confused and frightened by his failing body, dependent on her for care and comfort, she would suggest updating his will, perhaps leaving something to those who had truly been there for him in his final days. The children who had abandoned him certainly didn't deserve everything. The charities wouldn't miss a few million. But Catherine, who had been so devoted, so caring, who had sacrificed her own life to care for him, surely she deserved something? She had already been practicing his signature for 8 months, filling notebooks with attempts, studying the tremor in his hand caused by arthritis, the way his fingers couldn't quite grip the pen steadily anymore. The specific loops and flourishes that made his signature distinctive. She had hundreds of examples from documents around the house, had studied years of his signing style and how it had changed as he aged. She could forge it almost perfectly now, well enough to fool anyone who didn't do forensic analysis. She had already identified which estate attorney might be sympathetic to a grieving caregiver who had been like family to the deceased, a younger partner at Gerald Morrison's firm who seemed more interested in fees than ethics, who had witnessed his loneliness through Catherine's carefully constructed stories, who had seen his children's neglect through her curated lens. She would frame it as Maxwell's dying wish, the final clarity of a man facing his own mortality, that in his last lucid moment, he had wanted to ensure she was taken care of, that he had seen her as the daughter his own children had failed to be, that he had dictated changes to his will in whispered words she had carefully documented. With Maxwell dead, with her tears and testimony, with forged documents and careful timing, with the narrative she had been constructing for 3 years, she believed she could secure at least a significant portion of the estate. Perhaps 20%, maybe 30% if she played it perfectly. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe billions if she was bold enough and lucky enough and smart enough. Everything was in place. Every detail accounted for. Every contingency planned for. Every variable controlled. Everything except the dog. She hadn't accounted for the dog. That was her mistake. Her only mistake, but it would prove fatal to her plan. She began 3 weeks before that fateful morning, administering the first dose on a Tuesday evening when the autumn rain was hammering against the windows and Maxwell was feeling particularly lonely. Small doses mixed into his evening tea, the one ritual Catherine had taken over completely, had made her own special domain. She would prepare it herself in the kitchen, claiming she had a special blend that would help him sleep better, a recipe her grandmother had used in France. Maxwell had been grateful, touched by the personal attention. The tea did help him sleep, after all, though not for the reasons he thought. The poison was exhausting his system, forcing his body to fight a battle it didn't understand, draining his energy until sleep became the only escape. Maxwell started feeling weak within days, the poison working its dark magic through his system. Dizzy when he stood up too quickly, having to grip the furniture for balance. Nauseous at mealtimes, food losing its appeal, everything tasting vaguely metallic. His hands shook more than usual, the tremor spreading from fingers to wrists to arms. His breath came shorter, his heart struggling to maintain rhythm as the oleandrin interfered with its electrical signals. He would wake in the middle of the night with chest pains that faded by morning, leaving him wondering if he had imagined them, if his mind was playing tricks. His appetite disappeared, meals becoming an obligation rather than a pleasure. Food tasted wrong, metallic, bitter, often ways he couldn't quite describe. Perhaps we should call Dr. Brennan, Catherine suggested with perfect concern, her brow furrowed in worry that looked absolutely genuine. These symptoms, Mr. Kane, they worry me. You're not yourself. You haven't been yourself for weeks now. No, no. Maxwell waved her off, stubborn in the way elderly men can be when facing their own mortality, when admitting weakness feels like admitting defeat. Just old age catching up with me, that's all. Happens to everyone eventually. The body wears out like an old car. Parts start failing. I'm 74, Catherine. This is just what 74 looks like. Still, Catherine pressed gently, her voice calibrated perfectly between respect and insistence. It wouldn't hurt to have him check. Just to be safe, to rule out anything serious. I'd feel better knowing you were okay. I'd feel terrible if something happened, and we hadn't at least checked. Next week. Maxwell promised, always next week, always putting it off. If I'm not feeling better next week, I'll call him. I promise. But Catherine knew he wouldn't make it to next week. Not with what she had planned. Not with the doses she was preparing. Time was running out. The dog was making everything more difficult. She needed to end this soon. But Argus noticed everything, picked up on every change in his master's condition with the heightened awareness of an animal whose entire existence revolved around one person. The dog began sleeping directly beside Maxwell's bed, something he had never done before, breaking years of established routine. He had always slept in his own bed in the corner, a comfortable orthopedic dog bed that Maxwell had spent $500 on, perfectly positioned away from drafts and noise. Now he positioned himself on the floor next to Maxwell's nightstand, his body pressed against the bed frame, his ears alert even in sleep, twitching at every sound, every shift in breathing, every change in Maxwell's heartbeat that his sensitive hearing could detect through the mattress. He refused to leave Maxwell's side, even for meals, even for bathroom breaks. Thomas the butler had to bring his food to Maxwell's room because the dog wouldn't leave, would whine and pace and stare at the door if anyone tried to lead him away. When Catherine brought the evening tea, Argus would position himself between her and Maxwell, hackles raised, body tense like a coiled spring ready to explode into violence. The growl that emanated from him was unlike anything the household staff had heard before, something that made the hair on their necks stand up, something primordial and terrifying. It wasn't playful or territorial. It was a warning, a promise, a desperate attempt to communicate danger to a master who wouldn't listen. That dog really doesn't like me, Catherine said with a forced laugh, her hands trembling slightly as she set the teacup down on the nightstand, keeping her distance from the snarling animal, calculating whether the dog would actually attack if she pushed too close. I've tried so hard to befriend him. I bring him treats. I speak kindly to him. I've never done anything to deserve this hostility. Maxwell frowned, confused and troubled by his companion's behavior, his gentle friend transformed into something he barely recognized. I don't understand it. Argus has never been like this with anyone, not in 6 years. He's always been so gentle, so friendly, even with strangers. I don't know what's gotten into him. Perhaps he senses I'm trying to help you, and he feels threatened? Catherine suggested carefully, planting the seed with surgical precision, knowing exactly which psychological buttons to push. Dogs can be jealous, possessive, especially with elderly owners. Maybe he sees me as competition for your attention, for your affection. I've read about this phenomenon. It's actually quite common with elderly owners and their pets. They become overly protective, irrationally so, because they sense vulnerability and respond with territorial aggression. But jealousy doesn't make a dog station itself like a military guard, maintaining position for hours without rest. Jealousy doesn't make a dog's eyes track every movement with predatory precision, pupils dilated, every muscle coiled for action, body weight shifting to maintain perfect balance for a potential attack. Jealousy doesn't make a dog refuse food and water to maintain vigilance, ignoring basic survival instincts in service of a higher purpose. This wasn't jealousy. This was desperation. Because Argus knew. He could smell it in Catherine's sweat, the adrenaline, the fear of being caught, the excitement of getting away with murder. The chemical cocktail that humans secrete when they're lying, when they're afraid, when they're doing something they know is wrong. He could hear it in the microscopic changes in her heartbeat when she lied, the slight acceleration that betrayed deception even when her face remained perfectly composed. He could sense it in the way she moved, the subtle tension of someone always performing, always calculating, never genuine for even a moment. Argus knew his master was being poisoned. He could smell the poison in Maxwell's sweat, in his breath, in the chemical changes happening in his body. He just couldn't speak, couldn't explain, couldn't tell Maxwell in words that the woman he trusted was killing him slowly, day by day, cup by cup. All he could do was bark and growl and position himself as a barrier, hoping desperately that Maxwell would understand the message, would trust his instincts, would remember that animals know things humans have forgotten. But Maxwell didn't understand, couldn't understand, because humans trust words over instincts, trust smiles over warning signs, trust what they want to believe over what their gut tells them is true. Catherine's words made sense. Her concerns seemed genuine. Her care appeared real, while the dog's behavior seemed irrational, inexplicable, the product of animal jealousy or old age or some canine mental breakdown. Catherine grew frustrated, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the pressure of this four-legged obstacle. The dog was becoming a serious problem, a variable she couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't eliminate without raising suspicion. Every evening, she had to work around Argus's protective stance, had to prepare the poison tea in advance, and hand it to Maxwell from a distance, claiming she didn't want to agitate the dog, didn't want to stress Maxwell with conflict. It was working, the poison was doing its job, but barely. The dog's behavior was making Maxwell suspicious, making him question things, making him hesitate before drinking the tea, looking at it strangely, sometimes setting it down without finishing it. She tried locking Argus out of Maxwell's room at night, claiming the dog needed rest, needed his own space, that the constant vigilance was unhealthy for an aging animal. But the dog would bark and scratch at the door until Maxwell let him in. The old man shuffling across the room in his pajamas at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, concerned for his friend, unable to ignore the desperate sounds. He's frightened. Maxwell would explain to Catherine the next morning, his voice apologetic. Something's wrong with him. I don't know what, but something's wrong. Maybe I should take him to the vet. Maybe he's sick. Perhaps that's wise, Catherine agreed, hiding her frustration behind a mask of concern, secretly hoping the vet would recommend sedatives or separation, anything to get the dog away from Maxwell long enough to finish the job. He may be ill. Sometimes animals behave strangely when they're sick, when they're in pain. It could be neurological. Brain tumors in dogs can cause personality changes, aggression, paranoia. She tried giving Argus sedative-laced treats, crushing sleeping pills into premium beef, wrapping them in cheese and bacon, making them as appealing as possible. But he refused to take anything from her hands, wouldn't even sniff them, would pull back as if she was offering poison, which in a sense she was, would sniff it, recognize the chemical signature of drugs mixed with food, and walk away with what seemed like disdain. She tried leaving poisoned food in his bowl, mixing sedatives into his regular kibble, but he wouldn't touch that either. The dog had stopped eating anything she prepared, stopped drinking water from bowls she had access to. Only ate when Thomas fed him directly, and only then after watching Thomas prepare the food from fresh ingredients. The dog's eyes tracking every movement, making sure no one else touched it. She even considered poisoning the dog too, making it look like some illness had swept through the household, some contamination in the water or food that had affected both master and pet. But that would raise too many questions. Too suspicious. If both Maxwell and his beloved dog fell ill simultaneously, even the most incompetent investigator would smell foul play. The timing would be too convenient. And if the dog died first, Maxwell would be devastated, might call for a necropsy to determine the cause, might discover the poison before Catherine could finish her work. If Maxwell died first and the dog immediately after, that would raise red flags, trigger investigations, bring scrutiny she couldn't afford. So she made the decision to increase the dosage, to accelerate the timeline, to finish this before everything fell apart. Accelerate the timeline from her carefully planned 6-week deterioration to a rapid 3-week decline. She needed to finish this before Maxwell actually went to the doctor, before tests were run, before the poison could be discovered in his system, before modern medicine intervened and saved him and revealed what had been happening. She had been planning to drag this out for another 3 weeks, to make it look as natural as possible, a gradual fading that would seem like the inevitable sunset of an old life. But the dog had forced her hand. The dog and his constant vigilance and his uncanny ability to sense danger had compressed her timeline, had pushed her into taking risks she hadn't wanted to take. Maxwell's condition worsened rapidly over the next week, the increased dosage overwhelming his system faster than his body could compensate. He could barely get out of bed some mornings, would lie there staring at the ceiling, gathering strength just to sit up, just to put his feet on the floor. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a pen, couldn't sign his name, couldn't grip a fork without dropping it. His breathing grew labored, each inhale a struggle, like he was trying to breathe through wet cloth, his lungs not processing oxygen properly. His skin took on a grayish pallor, the color draining from his face, leaving him looking corpse-like even while alive. His eyes, once sharp and bright with intelligence, became clouded with pain and confusion, the light dimming as the poison accumulated in his brain tissue. "Mr. Kane, please," Catherine urged, genuine fear entering her voice now. Not for him, but for her plan, for the possibility that he might die in some unexpected way that would trigger an autopsy, that would reveal the poison before she could establish her narrative. "Let me call the doctor. You need help. This is serious. You're declining rapidly. This isn't normal aging." "Tomorrow," Maxwell whispered, his voice weak, barely audible, the effort of speaking exhausting him. "I'll go tomorrow. Just let me rest today. I'm so tired, Catherine. So tired." But Catherine knew she couldn't wait until tomorrow. If doctors examined him thoroughly now, with modern testing equipment and suspicious minds, they might find something unusual, might order comprehensive blood work, might discover the poison before she could complete her plan, before Maxwell could die and be cremated and have all evidence destroyed. She needed Maxwell dead before any medical intervention could occur, before anyone could save him, before the truth could come out. That morning, the morning everything changed, the morning her entire plan collapsed, Catherine prepared the final dose in the pre-dawn darkness. Enough oleandrin to stop his heart within hours, a massive dose that would finish what she had started. The amount was dangerous, reckless even, might leave obvious traces that even a cursory examination would catch, but she was out of time. The dog had forced her to rush. If Maxwell died this morning, she could claim he had been deteriorating for weeks, that she had begged him to see a doctor, that he had refused in typical stubborn elderly fashion, that she had done everything possible to help him. The household staff would support this narrative. They had all witnessed his decline. Thomas had expressed concern. The cook had noticed he wasn't eating. The housekeepers had seen how weak he had become. She made his breakfast as always, hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. Oatmeal with honey and cinnamon, exactly how he liked it, the recipe she had perfected over 3 years. She prepared it in the kitchen, alone, the early morning sun just beginning to stream through the windows, casting long shadows across the counter where she worked. Her hands were steady as she measured out the poison, the crystalline powder dissolving into the warm oatmeal. This was it. The moment everything changed. The moment 3 years of planning came to fruition. By tonight, Maxwell Kane would be dead. By next week, she would be crying at his funeral, playing the role of grief-stricken caregiver. By next month, she would be presenting the forged will to attorneys, backed by 3 years of documented devotion. By next year, she would be living the life she deserved, the life she had earned through patience and planning and perfect execution. She stirred in death with a silver spoon, the expensive one from the formal dining set, mixed it until the poison dissolved completely, leaving no trace, no residue, no visible evidence, nothing to give it away. She tasted a tiny amount from the edge of the spoon where the poison hadn't touched. Perfect sweetness, perfect consistency, perfect temperature. Maxwell would never suspect. He trusted her completely now. She had won his trust, his affection, his belief in her basic humanity. She had played the role perfectly. Catherine carried the bowl upstairs on a silver tray, along with fresh coffee, black, 1 sugar, and the morning newspaper, just like every other morning. She knocked softly on Maxwell's door, 3 gentle taps, the same rhythm she always used. "Good morning, Mr. Kane. I've brought your breakfast." Maxwell sat at the small table by the window in his bedroom, positioned to catch the morning light, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate gardens where autumn was painting the trees in golds and reds. He looked terrible, pale, shaking, clearly in pain, barely able to hold himself upright. But he managed a weak smile when she entered, still trying to maintain dignity, still trying to be gracious. "Thank you, Catherine. You're always so thoughtful. I don't know what I would do without you." The words were like knives in her chest, not because she felt guilt, but because they confirmed how completely she had won. He trusted her absolutely, and she was about to kill him. Argus lay at his feet, as always, his body pressed against Maxwell's legs. The dog's eyes locked onto Catherine the moment she entered the room, recognition and hatred burning in those amber depths. His body tensed instantly, every muscle coiling. A low growl started in his chest, building in intensity. "Argus, enough," Maxwell said tiredly, barely able to muster the energy to scold. "Please, boy, not this morning. I'm too tired for this. Just let me eat in peace." Catherine placed the bowl before him with a gentle smile, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, adrenaline flooding her system despite her outward calm. "Made fresh this morning, Mr. Kane. I added extra honey, just how you like it. And I made sure it was the perfect temperature. Not too hot. You know me too well," Maxwell said with a weak chuckle, reaching for his spoon. "You've been paying attention." She poured his coffee, the familiar ritual that she had performed 1,000 times. Set out his newspaper, folded to the business section he always read first. Performed the routine perfectly, exactly as she had done for 3 years. Nothing unusual, nothing to suggest this morning was different from any other. Then she stepped back to watch, positioning herself near the door, ready to leave the moment he swallowed the first bite. She would wait until he ate it, until she saw him consume the poison, saw the oatmeal pass his lips, and then she would leave. Make some excuse about starting the laundry or preparing lunch. Let nature take its course. Let the oleandrin do its work. In a few hours, she would hear Thomas shouting for help. Would rush in to find Maxwell dead or dying. Would perform CPR that she knew wouldn't work. Would call 911 with panic in her voice. Would cry real tears, though they would be tears of relief rather than grief. Maxwell lifted the spoon, his hand trembling from weakness and the poison already in his system. Brought it toward his mouth, moving slowly, carefully. The poisoned oatmeal gleamed in the morning sunlight, looking perfectly innocent, just breakfast. Steam rose from it gently. Catherine held her breath, and Argus exploded into motion. The bark was unlike anything Maxwell had ever heard from him, unlike anything anyone in the house had ever heard. A savage, desperate warning that came from somewhere beyond training, beyond domestication, beyond the thin veneer of civilization that separated dog from wolf. It was the sound of a wild animal protecting its pack from a predator. The sound of absolute terror and absolute determination. The sound of an animal willing to die to save the one creature it loved more than life itself. The dog launched himself at the table with a force that defied his age and size, his entire body airborne, muscles bunching and releasing with explosive power. His paws connected with the table edge, the solid oak table that weighed 50 pounds, sending the bowl flying. Porcelain shattered against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. Oatmeal splattered across the white marble in a grotesque sunburst pattern, spreading out in all directions. Coffee spilled, the dark liquid mixing with the pale oatmeal. The newspaper scattered, pages flying. The silver tray clattered to the ground with a metallic crash that echoed through the room. "Argus!" Maxwell shouted, shock and anger flooding through him, his voice stronger than it had been in days, adrenaline cutting through the fog of poison. "What the hell are you doing? That's enough. Bad dog." The shock was too much for his weakened system, his heart already compromised by weeks of poisoning. His heart, already stressed from the oleandrin in his system, seized in his chest. Not from the final dose. He hadn't ingested any this time. The bowl had shattered before it reached his lips, but from the adrenaline spike, the shock, the stress of the moment, the fear that flooded his body. Maxwell clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain, his eyes going wide. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him, gave out beneath him like they were made of water. He collapsed from his chair, hitting the floor hard, his shoulder taking the impact. Catherine screamed, a perfect performance of horror and concern, hitting exactly the right note of panic. "Mr. Kane." She rushed forward, or appeared to, covering half the distance before stopping. She needed witnesses. Needed this to look right. Needed people to see her trying to help, see her desperate to reach him. "Someone help. Call an ambulance." Thomas the butler came running, his footsteps thundering up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He had been in the library, doing his morning inventory of the wine cellar. The cook followed, a woman named Maria who had worked for the family for 15 years. Two housekeepers who had been changing linens on the third floor. Everyone who heard the crash and the scream came running. They burst into the room to find Maxwell on the floor, gasping for air, clutching his chest, his face gray. But Argus didn't move to Maxwell's side. That's what stopped everyone. That's what made them all freeze in the doorway. The dog always went to Maxwell when he was hurt or sick, always pressed against him, offering comfort and warmth. When Maxwell had fallen in the bathroom 2 years ago, Argus had lain beside him for 20 minutes until help came, had kept him warm, had licked his face to keep him conscious. When Maxwell had the flu last winter, Argus had slept on his bed, something he never did, providing comfort. But not now. Instead, Argus stood over his fallen master, positioning himself between Maxwell and everyone else, creating a barrier with his body. His stance was aggressive, protective, territorial in a way they had never seen. His body was coiled like a spring ready to strike, weight balanced perfectly for either attack or defense. His teeth were bared, white and sharp and promising violence. And he growled, deep, primal, continuous, a sound that raised the hair on everyone's arms. Catherine took a step forward, her mask slipping for just a moment as frustration and rage flashed across her face, all her careful control cracking under the pressure. Let me help him. Move. Get out of the way so I can help him. Argus lunged at her with no hesitation, no warning. Not a playful snap, not a warning nip. A full attack, jaws open, aiming for her throat. He would have torn into her, would have ripped her apart, if Thomas hadn't been there. Catherine stumbled backward, terror flashing across her face. Real terror, not performed. The mask completely shattered now. She hit the wall, her carefully constructed composure destroyed. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open, her professional demeanor replaced by pure animal fear. Get that dog away, she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that revealed the person beneath the mask, the desperate criminal beneath the professional caregiver. He's insane. He's dangerous. He's going to kill someone. Get him away from me. But Thomas, a man who had worked for Maxwell for 20 years, who had watched Argus grow from a scared rescue into a noble companion, who had seen the bond between man and dog deepen into something extraordinary, hesitated. He had never seen the dog behave this way. Never seen him show aggression toward anyone, not once in 6 years. And he had never seen the dog wrong about anything. Argus had alerted them when Maxwell had fallen in the bathroom 2 years ago, had barked until they found him unconscious on the tile, had warned them about a gas leak in the kitchen, pawing at Thomas's leg and whining until he had followed the dog and discovered the stove had been left on, had sensed Maxwell's heart palpitations minutes before they occurred, pawing at him until he sat down, potentially preventing a more serious cardiac event. The dog was never wrong. Thomas looked at Catherine, really looked at her for the first time in 3 years, and saw something he had never noticed before. Saw the calculation in her eyes, the coldness that lived beneath the warm surface, the rage, the fear of being caught, the desperation of someone whose plan had fallen apart. Then he looked at the spilled oatmeal on the floor, spreading across the white marble in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. At the shattered bowl, pieces of expensive porcelain scattered everywhere. At Argus standing guard, refusing to let anyone near his master except to protect him. Something clicked in Thomas's mind. The dog's behavior over the past weeks. The constant growling at Catherine. The refusal to leave Maxwell's side. The way Argus had knocked the bowl away just before Maxwell could eat. Not after. Before. As if the dog knew something was in that oatmeal. Something dangerous. Call an ambulance, Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos, despite the fear, despite everything. Right now? And someone call the police. The police. Catherine's voice cracked, all pretense of composure gone. Why would we? Thomas, what are you suggesting? He had a heart attack. He needs medical help, not police. Call an ambulance. Thomas repeated, louder now, his voice carrying authority, the voice of a man who had run this household when Maxwell was too busy running his empire. And someone call the police. Now. Nobody touch that oatmeal. Nobody touch anything in this room. Thomas, that's ridiculous. Catherine protested, but her voice was shaking, panic evident in every word. You're being paranoid. The dog is just upset, just confused. Maria, call 911. Thomas ordered, ignoring Catherine completely. Tell them we need paramedics and we need police. Tell them there may have been an attempted poisoning. Catherine's face went pale, all the color draining from it like someone had pulled a plug. What? Why would you? Thomas, what are you suggesting? I would never. How dare you imply? But Thomas didn't answer. He knelt beside Maxwell, checking his pulse with steady hands, careful not to cross into the space where Argus stood guard, respecting the boundary the dog had established. The dog allowed this, recognized Thomas as safe, as someone who genuinely cared for Maxwell. Hold on, Mr. Kane. Help is coming. Just hold on. Maxwell's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and confusion. He saw Argus standing over him, saw the protective stance, saw the dog's body positioned like a shield, saw Thomas's grim expression, saw Catherine backing toward the door, her composure completely shattered now, her hands shaking, her face pale. And in that moment, through the pain and confusion and fear, something clicked into place in Maxwell's mind. All the pieces suddenly fit together. The dog's constant warnings over the past 3 years. The way Argus had refused to leave his side these past weeks. The growling whenever Catherine came near. The aggression toward her, and only her. The spilled bowl, knocked away just before the spoon reached his lips. Thomas's order to preserve the evidence. The sudden understanding of what almost happened. Oh God, Maxwell whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She tried to. Argus, you knew all along. You tried to tell me. The dog's amber eyes met his master's, held his gaze with an intensity that transcended species. And in that look past everything that needed to be said. Loyalty, protection, love that required no words. Forgiveness for not being believed. relief that his master finally understood. Maxwell Kane survived that morning, though the hours that followed were touch and go. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, a response time that probably saved his life, provided emergency cardiac care, administered medications that stabilized his heart rhythm, stabilized him enough for transport. The heart episode had been stress-induced, aggravated by his weakened condition, but the damage was minimal because he hadn't ingested the final lethal dose. If he had eaten that oatmeal, if Argus hadn't stopped him, he would have been dead by afternoon. The paramedics worked efficiently, professionally, starting in 4, administering oxygen, monitoring his vitals, preparing him for transport. He was rushed to the hospital, Argus riding in the ambulance with him. The paramedics had tried to leave the dog behind, citing regulations about animals in emergency vehicles, but Maxwell had refused to go without him, had clutched the dog's collar, and said, "He saved my life, he comes with me." And Thomas had insisted with an authority that brooked no argument. The dog sat perfectly still during the entire ride, his body pressed against Maxwell's gurney, his eyes never leaving his master's face, as if maintaining visual contact could keep Maxwell alive through sheer will. At the hospital, Dr. Brennan arrived within the hour, having been called by Thomas with an urgent message about possible poisoning. He had been Maxwell's physician for 30 years, had seen him through multiple health crises, knew his medical history intimately, knew what was normal for Maxwell and what wasn't. He listened to the paramedics' report, examined Maxwell with practiced hands, and frowned deeply. Something about the symptoms didn't add up. The weakness, the nausea, the heart palpitations, the tremors, they were consistent with cardiac issues, yes, but there were other signs. The metallic taste Maxwell described, the progressive confusion over weeks, the rapid deterioration in someone who had been relatively healthy just a month ago. This wasn't normal cardiac disease. Maxwell, Dr. Brennan said, sitting beside the hospital bed once his patient was stable, his expression grave. "I'm going to order a full toxicology panel. Something doesn't feel right about this. Your symptoms aren't consistent with simple heart disease." Maxwell nodded weakly, barely able to move his head. "Do it. Thomas thinks. I think someone may have been poisoning me. My maid, Catherine. My dog kept trying to warn me. I should have listened to him." Dr. Brennan's expression hardened, years of professional composure barely masking his shock and anger. "Who?" "The maid. Catherine Morrow. She's been bringing me tea every night for weeks. And she made my breakfast this morning. Argus knocked it away just before I could eat it. I'll order the full panel immediately. We'll test for everything." The results came back 48 hours later, though those 48 hours felt like an eternity to Maxwell, lying in the hospital bed, police guards outside his door, wondering if the person he had trusted had really tried to murder him. Oleandrin. Significant levels throughout Maxwell's system, detected in his blood, his urine, his hair follicles. Consistent with repeated exposure over an extended period, approximately 3 weeks based on metabolite analysis, though possibly longer with smaller doses that had been metabolized. The concentration was high enough that if he had consumed the breakfast that morning, the dose would have been lethal within 6 hours. The medical examiner who reviewed the results later testified that Maxwell would have appeared to have died of a heart attack, and without specific testing for oleandrin, it would never have been detected. Catherine's plan had been nearly perfect. Dr. Brennan sat beside Maxwell's hospital bed, his face grave, his hands clasped together, struggling to maintain professional composure while dealing with the reality that one of his patients had nearly been murdered. "Someone has been poisoning you, Maxwell. Deliberately. Systematically. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. Someone has been administering oleandrin to you over an extended period. If you had eaten that breakfast..." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They both knew. Maxwell stared at him, the full weight of it crashing down like an avalanche. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal, intimate, a violation of trust that went to the core of what it meant to be human. Someone he had trusted, someone he had welcomed into his home, someone he had defended against his dog's warnings, someone he had begun to think of as family. That person had looked him in the eye every single day while slowly killing him. Catherine really tried to kill me. For 3 weeks, she was poisoning me. The evidence is clear. The oleandrin levels would have been fatal if you had consumed what was in that breakfast. Your dog saved your life by knocking that bowl away. If you had ingested what our analysis suggests was in that oatmeal, you would have been dead by this evening. There's no question. Maxwell closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal. He thought about Catherine's smile, the way it had seemed so genuine. Her gentle touches, the concerned questions, the way she had seemed to genuinely care. Every moment of perceived kindness had been a lie. Every gesture of care had been manipulation leading toward murder. Every conversation had been part of a long con. She had looked him in the eye every single day, had asked about his health, had expressed concern, all while slowly poisoning him, planning his death, counting his money. But Argus had known. From the very beginning, from the moment Catherine had entered their lives 3 years ago, Argus had known. And Maxwell had ignored him, had scolded him, had dismissed his warnings as jealousy or irrationality. "Where's my dog?" Maxwell asked suddenly, his voice stronger now despite his physical weakness. "Where's Argus? I need to see him." The hospital doesn't typically allow animals except registered service dogs. "I don't care about typical hospital policy," Maxwell interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of the authority that had built empires. "That dog saved my life. That dog tried to warn me for weeks, and I didn't listen. Where is he?" Thomas, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room for the entire 48 hours, barely sleeping, barely eating, maintaining his vigil, stood up. "I've been keeping him at the estate, sir. Bringing him food 3 times a day, taking him for walks in the garden. He's been waiting by your bedroom door. Won't leave the spot. Won't eat much. Just waits. Bring him here," Maxwell said, his voice stronger now despite his weakness, despite everything. "I don't care what rules I have to break or what bribes I have to pay. I don't care if I have to buy this entire hospital. Bring him to me." Now, Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile in 2 days. Yes, sir. I'll have him here within the hour. Dr. Brennan started to protest, then saw the look on Maxwell's face and thought better of it. I'll arrange for a private room where hospital administration might be more flexible about the rules. The police investigation moved quickly once the toxicology results confirmed poisoning. Detective Sarah Chun arrived at the hospital within hours of the results, a sharp woman in her 40s with keen eyes and 20 years of experience in wealthy estate crimes. She had seen this pattern before, too many times. Caretakers who viewed vulnerable elderly people as opportunities rather than human beings, who saw bank accounts rather than souls, who calculated inheritance timelines the way others calculated retirement plans. They secured a warrant within hours and searched Catherine's room in the estate. What they found was more damning than even Detective Chun had anticipated. Encrypted messaging apps on her phone with conversations about inheritance laws and mental competency evaluations, discussing the best ways to manipulate elderly people, to isolate them from family, to position oneself for inheritance claims. Search history on poisonous plants and their effects, dozens of pages researched over months. Research on how to forge signatures, entire forums dedicated to document forgery. A notebook hidden in her mattress with practice attempts at Maxwell's signature. Dozens of pages showing her progression from crude imitation to near-perfect forgery. Dated entries tracking her improvement over 8 months. They found bank account information for offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, already containing $200,000 that Catherine had embezzled slowly over 3 years through fake household expenses and inflated bills. They found photographs she had taken of valuable items in the house, Monet paintings, Faberge eggs, rare sculptures, with price estimates written on the back in her handwriting. They found a burner phone with contacts to estate attorneys, one of whom specialized in contested wills and had already been paid a $10,000 retainer. And most damning of all, they found a forged copy of Maxwell's will, elaborately produced on expensive paper with official-looking seals and notary stamps she had purchased on the dark web. It named Catherine Moreau as primary beneficiary, leaving her controlling interest in Kane Industries and $4 billion in liquid assets, with smaller amounts to his children for the pain they caused their father in his final years. It was a masterpiece of forgery, sophisticated enough that it might have fooled probate court if no one had looked too closely. She had been planning to produce it after his death, claiming Maxwell had changed it privately in his final weeks, that he had wanted to ensure the person who truly cared for him was taken care of, that his ungrateful children didn't deserve his fortune. The detectives also tested the spilled oatmeal from the kitchen floor that Thomas had carefully preserved, scooping it into evidence bags. The oleandrin levels were catastrophic, 20 times the lethal dose. Dr. Brennan later testified that if Maxwell had consumed even a quarter of that bowl, he would have been dead within 4 hours. It wasn't even subtle at that concentration. Catherine had been desperate, rushed, sloppy in her final attempt. The dog had literally saved his master from certain death. When detectives arrived to arrest her, Catherine had been packing a suitcase in her room. She had sensed the walls closing in, had been preparing to run. She had drained the offshore accounts, converting everything to cryptocurrency that couldn't be easily traced. She had a passport under a different name, Claire Dubois, with her photograph but false documentation. A plane ticket to Montreal, then on to Paris. Then she would disappear into Europe. She almost made it out the door. Detective Chun entered the room just as Catherine was zipping up her suitcase, her hand on the doorknob. Catherine Moreau, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Maxwell Kane. Catherine's mask finally shattered completely. The composed professional caregiver disappeared, replaced by something feral and desperate. He was dying anyway, she screamed as they handcuffed her, her voice rising to a shriek. Old, alone, wasting all that money on nothing. I deserved it. I took care of him for 3 years. 3 years of my life. You tried to murder him for his money, Detective Chin said flatly. He would have died happy, thinking someone loved him. I was doing him a favor. Those children of his didn't care. I was there every single day. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of rage and self-pity, not remorse. I earned that money. Every single dollar. Thomas, watching from the doorway, felt sick. How had they all missed it? How had a monster smiled in their house for 3 years, and none of them had seen it? Then he looked down at Argus, who sat calmly beside him, and he understood. The dog had known all along. The dog had tried to tell them. They just hadn't listened. Maxwell returned home 3 weeks later after a hospital stay, focused on flushing the poison from his system and rebuilding his strength. The house felt different now. Colder, violated, like a sanctuary that had been desecrated. He had increased security, installed cameras in every room, changed all the locks, and dismissed the agency that had sent Catherine. He conducted personal interviews for every staff member, looking into their eyes, trusting his instincts in ways he never had before. But trust, once broken so profoundly, doesn't heal easily. He found himself suspicious of everyone. The new housekeeper, the day nurse Dr. Brennan insisted he hire. Even Thomas sometimes, though Thomas had literally saved his life. Except Argus. He trusted Argus absolutely. The dog had saved his life, had tried to warn him for 3 years, had positioned himself between Maxwell and death itself, had sacrificed his own comfort and peace to stand guard over a master who wouldn't listen. Maxwell sat in his study that evening, Argus's head resting on his knee, the familiar weight grounding him. You knew, Maxwell said softly, stroking the dog's ears. You knew the whole time, didn't you, boy? For 3 years you tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Argus gazed up at him with those amber eyes, and Maxwell saw forgiveness there. Saw love that required no apology. Saw loyalty that transcended the failure to be believed. He thought about his children, who had finally called after the attempted murder became international news, not out of love or concern, but because reporters were asking questions. They wanted to know about the will, about their inheritance, about whether he was thinking clearly after such a traumatic experience. Richard had actually suggested maybe he should step down from his board positions, let younger minds take over, perhaps move to an assisted living facility for his own safety. Victoria had cried on the phone, but her questions kept circling back to whether he planned to change his will. James had sent his campaign manager to check on him, and the man had spent an hour discussing optics and how this situation could be managed to avoid political fallout. The same cold calculation he had heard in Catherine's voice. Different faces, same greed. They saw him as an asset to be managed, protected, not out. Maxwell made a decision that night. He called his estate attorney the next morning. Gerald Morrison arrived within the hour, briefcase in hand, confusion and concern on his face. Maxwell, I came as soon as I could. What's this about completely rewriting your will? I'm leaving everything to Argus, Maxwell said simply. Gerald stared at him. You're leaving $8 billion to a dog. I'm leaving it to the only creature on this earth who has proven his loyalty beyond question. The only one who tried to save my life, while everyone else was either trying to kill me or waiting for me to die so they could collect. Maxwell, your children. My children, Maxwell interrupted, his voice hard as steel, haven't visited me in 4 years except when they need money. They call twice a year, on my birthday and when they want something. They've already proven what they value. Let them earn their own fortunes like I did. Gerald sighed heavily. The media will crucify you for this. Let them. Your children will contest it. Let them try. I'm of sound mind. Dr. Brennan will testify to that. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Gerald looked at the dog sitting calmly beside Maxwell's chair. You realize a dog cannot directly own property. We'll need to structure this carefully. A trust with appointed trustees, proper care provisions. Then structure it. I want Argus cared for in luxury for the rest of his life. After that, every remaining penny goes to animal welfare organizations. Not 1 cent to my children. Maxwell, they'll still have their trust funds from their mother's estate. They'll be fine, but they'll learn that love cannot be inherited. Loyalty cannot be bought. And I'll be damned if I reward them for treating me like an ATM while a dog showed me more humanity than my own blood. Gerald looked at Maxwell's face and saw absolute resolve. All right, I'll draft it. The will was finalized within a week. Word leaked, as it always does with billionaires. The headline exploded across every news network. Billionaire leaves entire fortune to dog who saved his life. Social media erupted. Half the world thought it was beautiful. Finally, someone who understands real loyalty. The other half thought it was insane. He's punishing his children out of spite. Maxwell's children hired attorneys and filed suit immediately, claiming he was not of sound mind. The case went to court. The proceedings were brutal, but Maxwell's legal team was ready. They presented evidence of his children's neglect, their transactional relationship with their father, their immediate concern about money rather than his well-being after the poisoning. Judge Patricia Holbrook listened carefully to 3 weeks of testimony. On the final day, she asked Maxwell to take the stand. Mr. Kane, I need to understand. Why did you make this decision? Maxwell looked at his children sitting in the gallery, barely able to meet his eyes. Then he looked at Argus, sitting calmly beside Gerald Morrison. Your Honor, I built an empire over 50 years. I sacrificed everything for wealth I thought would secure my family's future. But when I was dying, slowly, poisoned in my own home, not one of my children noticed. Not one called to check on me. His voice cracked. But my dog noticed. My dog, who cannot speak, who cannot call 911, who cannot understand money or wills or inheritance. He noticed. He fought. He positioned himself between me and death. He tried everything in his limited power to save me. Maxwell looked directly at Judge Holbrook. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing it because loyalty is the rarest currency on earth. And I choose to honor the only creature who showed it to me when it mattered most. Let the world think I'm crazy. I'd rather be crazy and loyal than sane and surrounded by people waiting for me to die. The courtroom was silent. Judge Holbrook removed her glasses. Mr. Kane, this court finds you to be of sound mind and judgment. Your will stands as written. Case dismissed. The ruling made international news. Maxwell became a symbol of loyalty over greed, of standing by one's principles. His children never spoke to him again, but the public wasn't sympathetic to them. Catherine Moreau was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Maxwell watched the sentencing from his study, Argus beside him. She'll spend half her life in a cage, Maxwell said softly. Does that make me feel better? Argus tilted his head. No, Maxwell admitted. It doesn't. But at least justice was served. Maxwell lived 3 more peaceful years after that. He sold his companies, traveled with Argus to places he'd always wanted to see, started a blog about life, loyalty, and what matters in the end. It gained millions of followers hungry for authenticity. He wrote about how Argus had taught him that loyalty isn't transactional, love isn't conditional, and worth isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in moments. Maxwell Kane died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning at 77. Argus was curled beside him. The dog woke when Maxwell's breathing stopped, nudged him gently, then laid his head on Maxwell's chest, and stayed there until Thomas found them. The funeral was small, but 3,000 strangers lined the streets holding signs. Loyalty over legacy. Argus knew. Love isn't inherited. In shelters across the world, adoption rates spiked. People wanted to find their own Argus, to give a chance to the abandoned and overlooked. Argus lived 2 more years, cared for exactly as Maxwell had specified, with dignity, comfort, and endless love. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, $7.2 billion flowed to animal welfare organizations worldwide. Enough to save millions of lives. Enough to ensure no dog would ever be abandoned behind a dumpster in the rain, hoping for someone to see them. Maxwell's children tried one final lawsuit after Argus died. The judge denied it in 5 minutes. Your father's will was clear. This money was left to honor loyalty. You spent years proving you possess none. Case dismissed. Today, the Argus Cane Foundation is one of the largest animal welfare organizations on Earth. In shelters across the world, there are plaques that read, "In memory of Argus and Maxwell Cain." Because loyalty deserves to be honored. Maxwell Cain left everything to a dog. The world called him crazy. But maybe he was the sanest man alive. Because he understood something the rest of us forget. The greatest wealth isn't in what you own. It's in who stands beside you when everything else falls away. And sometimes, the greatest wisdom comes from creatures who cannot speak at all. You just have to be willing to listen. If this story moved you, remember, there's an animal in a shelter right now, waiting for someone to see them the way Maxwell saw Argus. And if you have someone in your life, human or animal, who has stood by you when everyone else walked away, tell them today. Because life is short, and the ones who truly love us deserve to know they're seen. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths.